Los Angeles, late autumn, 1968, just after noon. The lunch crowd had filled every table inside the small Chinese restaurant on Broadway. Steam drifted from bowls of soup. Porcelain clinked against chopsticks. Conversations layered over one another in Cantonese, English, and the low background hum of the kitchen. It was the kind of place where regulars sat in the same seats every week, and waiters already knew what you were going to order. Bruce Lee sat alone at a corner table near the wall. A pot of tea rested beside him, still steaming. In front of him sat a simple lunch: rice, vegetables, and a small plate of roasted pork. He had been walking all morning. Teaching classes earlier that day at his martial arts school had left him hungry, and this restaurant was only 2 blocks away. Quiet, affordable, familiar. Bruce preferred places like this, places where he could sit without interruption and think. His mind was not on the food. It was on movement, on timing, on the idea he had been developing for weeks about intercepting attacks rather than blocking them. He replayed the idea in his head, imagining angles, imagining distance, imagining how a faster fighter could end a confrontation before it even fully began. He poured himself another cup of tea. The door opened. At first, nobody paid much attention. The restaurant door opened dozens of times during lunch, but this time the sound of conversation dropped slightly. A man stepped inside. He was tall, broad shoulders, maybe 6'3", close to 220 pounds. His jacket hung loose over a dark shirt, and his movements had the slow confidence of someone used to being watched. 3 other men followed behind him. They didn't look like customers. They looked like they were there because he was there. The man's name was Victor Delgado. Most people in that neighborhood knew it, not because he owned anything, because he controlled things, protection, collections, favors that came with expectations later. Restaurants on that street paid attention when Victor Delgado walked in. The owner of the restaurant stepped forward quickly, forcing a polite smile. Victor didn't smile back. He scanned the room. His eyes moved slowly across the tables until they landed on Bruce. Victor frowned slightly. Not recognition. Something else. Curiosity mixed with irritation. He walked toward the corner table. Every step slowed the room a little more. Bruce noticed him coming, but did not look up immediately. He took another sip of tea. Victor stopped beside the table. "You!" Bruce looked up calmly. "Yes?" Victor tilted his head. "You new here?" "No." Bruce gestured lightly to the empty chair across from him. "Just eating lunch." Victor didn't sit. Instead, he looked Bruce up and down. The thin frame, the narrow shoulders, the calm posture. "You Chinese?" Bruce raised an eyebrow slightly. "Yes?" Victor nodded slowly. "Then you should know something about respect." Bruce waited. Victor leaned closer to the table. "This restaurant pays to stay open." Bruce said nothing. Victor tapped the table lightly with his finger. "People who sit here, they understand how things work." Bruce folded his hands on the table. "And how do things work?" Victor smiled faintly. "If I sit somewhere, you get up." The room had gone quiet enough that nearby tables could hear every word. Bruce glanced at the empty tables around them. "There are many open seats." Victor's smile faded. "You're in this one." Bruce looked at his plate, then back at Victor. "I'm still eating." Victor stared at him. A few seconds passed. Behind Victor, one of his men chuckled. "This guy doesn't get it." Victor reached slowly for the teapot on Bruce's table. Bruce watched his hand move. Victor lifted the pot. Steam curled from the spout, hot, freshly poured. He tilted it. The tea spilled across Bruce's shoulder and chest. The liquid soaked into his shirt instantly. A few drops splashed onto the table. The restaurant froze. Nobody spoke. A waitress near the kitchen door stopped moving completely. Victor placed the empty teapot back on the table. "You're finished now." Bruce looked down at the tea soaking his shirt. He took a napkin and wiped a small drop from the table. Then he set the napkin down. Slowly, calmly. He stood. Victor smirked slightly. "That's better." Bruce looked directly at him. "You're done?" Victor blinked once. "What?" "With the performance?" One of Victor's men laughed loudly. Victor didn't. He stepped closer. "You think this is funny?" Bruce shook his head. "No." "Then leave." Bruce glanced around the restaurant. Every person was watching. Some looked nervous. Some looked embarrassed. The owner looked terrified. Bruce picked up his teacup. It was still half full. He took a sip, set it down again. Victor's face darkened. "You deaf?" Bruce answered quietly. "I heard you." Victor stepped closer until they were almost chest to chest. "You want to make this difficult?" Bruce looked at him carefully. Victor was big, strong, used to getting what he wanted. But there was something else Bruce noticed immediately. Victor's balance was wrong. His weight leaned too far forward. His stance was wide but sloppy. Street confidence, not training. Bruce spoke evenly. "You poured tea on me," Victor shrugged. "You should thank me. It's how people learn." Bruce nodded slightly. "You believe that?" Victor leaned closer. "Move." Bruce did not move. Victor reached forward and shoved him, hard. Bruce stepped back once. The restaurant gasped quietly. Victor smiled. "That's right." Bruce straightened his shirt. "Are you finished?" Victor laughed loudly now. "You still here?" He shoved Bruce again, harder this time. Bruce didn't step back. Victor noticed. His smile disappeared. Bruce spoke softly. "Now you're finished." Victor frowned. "What did you say?" Bruce's hands moved, not fast, not dramatic, just precise. His left hand caught Victor's wrist as it pushed forward again. His right hand struck Victor's elbow from underneath. A small motion, almost invisible. Victor's arm folded awkwardly. His balance shifted. Before he could recover, Bruce stepped slightly to the side and swept Victor's front leg. Victor's body tilted. Then the floor hit him, hard. The sound of it echoed through the restaurant. One moment he had been standing over Bruce. The next he was flat on his back, staring at the ceiling. The room erupted with shocked breaths. Victor tried to sit up. Bruce was already there. Knee pressed lightly into Victor's chest, one hand controlling his wrist, the other hovering calmly above his face, not striking, just waiting. Victor froze. His men had stepped forward but stopped. The movement had taken less than 3 seconds. They hadn't even understood what had happened. Victor looked up at Bruce. Confusion replaced anger. "What? What did you—" Bruce spoke quietly. "Stay still." Victor stayed still. Not because of fear, because instinct told him that moving would make things worse. Bruce leaned slightly closer. "You wanted the table." Victor swallowed. Bruce released his wrist slowly, then stood up. He stepped back. Victor sat up slowly, breathing hard. The restaurant was completely silent. Bruce picked up his teacup again, finished the last sip. Then he looked down at Victor. "You spilled my tea." Victor stared at him, still trying to understand how the world had flipped so quickly. Bruce continued calmly. "Strength is not loud." He gestured slightly toward the room. "Respect is not taken like that." Victor's men did not move. Neither did anyone else. Bruce looked around the restaurant, then back at Victor. "You came here to show power." Victor said nothing. Bruce nodded slightly. But power without control is only noise. Victor slowly stood up. His chest still hurt from the fall. He looked at Bruce carefully now, not the way he had earlier, different, calculating. "Who are you?" Bruce answered simply. "Bruce Lee." Victor repeated it quietly. "Bruce Lee?" The name meant nothing to him yet, but something about the man standing in front of him did. Bruce picked up his jacket, turned toward the door, then paused. He looked back at Victor one last time. "You could learn something useful." Victor frowned slightly. "Like what?" Bruce gestured toward the floor. "How to stay standing." Bruce walked toward the door. Nobody tried to stop him. Nobody spoke. The restaurant remained frozen until the door closed behind him. Victor stood there for a long moment. Then he slowly exhaled. One of his men finally spoke. "What just happened?" Victor rubbed his chest. "I'm not sure." Years later, after Bruce Lee had become known around the world, a man who had been sitting in that restaurant that afternoon told the story to a journalist. He remembered the tea. He remembered the silence. But most of all, he remembered the moment when the room realized something important. The skinny man everyone expected to leave had not raised his voice, had not lost control, had not tried to humiliate anyone. He had simply demonstrated a truth that most people only talk about. Real strength doesn't announce itself, it waits. And when the moment comes, it moves once. Victor Delgado stood in the middle of the restaurant long after the door closed behind Bruce Lee. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The entire room seemed to remain suspended in the moment that had just happened. Victor slowly rolled his shoulder. The fall had not broken anything, but it had taken the air out of him in a way he hadn't expected. His ribs still ached from the impact against the floor. He had been in fights before. Street fights, bar fights, situations where men pulled knives or swung chairs. He had won some, lost some, but never like that, never in silence, never in 3 seconds. One of his men finally spoke. "You all right, Vic?" Victor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the floor where he had landed. Then he looked at the table where Bruce had been sitting. The teacup was still there. Half a plate of rice remained untouched. Victor frowned. He didn't even spill the tea. His men exchanged confused looks. The owner of the restaurant approached slowly, nervous but trying to appear polite. "Mr. Delgado, is everything all right?" Victor looked at him. For the first time since walking in, he didn't seem interested in intimidation. He seemed thoughtful. "Yeah," he straightened his jacket. "Everything's fine." He glanced toward the door again. Then he turned to leave. His men followed quietly behind him. Nobody spoke until they reached the sidewalk. Outside, the afternoon sun hit the street hard. Victor lit a cigarette. One of his men leaned closer. "You want us to find that guy?" Victor shook his head slowly. "No." The man looked surprised. Victor exhaled smoke. "That wasn't a fight." "What do you mean?" Victor thought about it. "That was a lesson." The man frowned. "A lesson about what?" Victor flicked the cigarette ash onto the pavement. "About the difference between being strong and just looking strong." Inside the restaurant, conversation slowly began again. The tension dissolved in pieces. Plates moved again. Chopsticks clicked softly. But people kept glancing at the door where Bruce had left. The waitress, who had frozen near the kitchen, whispered to another server. "Did you see how fast that was?" The other nodded. "I didn't even see him move." At the corner table, the owner carefully picked up the teapot Victor had used earlier. He stared at it for a moment, then quietly replaced it with a clean one. 2 blocks away, Bruce Lee walked calmly down the sidewalk. His shirt was still damp where the tea had soaked into the fabric. He didn't seem bothered by it. His mind was already somewhere else. He was thinking about timing, the small shift in Victor's weight just before the sweep, the way his balance had collapsed when the elbow joint had folded. Simple mechanics. Nothing complicated. Just efficiency. Bruce believed that the best technique was the one that required the least effort, not the flashiest, not the most dramatic, just the most direct. He reached the martial arts school a few minutes later. The door was locked. Bruce pulled a key from his pocket and opened it. Inside, the room smelled faintly of wood polish and sweat from the morning's class. The mats were still laid out. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He walked across the room slowly. His student, Jesse Glover, arrived a few minutes later. Jesse noticed the stain on Bruce's shirt immediately. "Hey, what happened to you?" Bruce glanced down. "Oh, just tea." Jesse laughed. "Looks like someone threw a whole pot at you." Bruce nodded slightly. "Something like that." Jesse waited. He knew Bruce well enough to know there was probably a story behind it. "What happened?" Bruce picked up a towel and wiped his hands. "A man wanted my table." "And?" Bruce shrugged lightly. "He had it for a moment." Jesse looked confused. "For a moment?" Bruce smiled faintly. "Then he didn't." Jesse laughed. "I bet he didn't." Bruce walked to the center of the training floor. He gestured for Jesse to step forward. "Come." Jesse stepped onto the mat. Bruce raised his hands. "Attack me!" Jesse lunged forward with a quick punch. Bruce moved. The same movement, the same timing, wrist control, elbow break, leg sweep. Jesse landed flat on his back before he even understood what had happened. Bruce stepped back calmly. "Again?" Jesse sat up, shaking his head. "Man, one day someone is going to try you in the wrong place." Bruce smiled slightly. "That happens often." Jesse stood again. "But it never seems to go wrong for you." Bruce shook his head. "It goes wrong when people fight with anger." He gestured toward Jesse. "Try again." Jesse attacked again. Bruce intercepted the movement instantly, not blocking, stopping the attack before it even formed. Jesse stopped and laughed. "You make it look too easy." Bruce folded his arms. "It isn't easy." Jesse wiped sweat from his forehead. "Then why does it look like that?" Bruce thought about it for a moment. "Because by the time the fight begins," he tapped his temple, "it is already finished here." Jesse nodded slowly. Across town, Victor Delgado sat in his car outside a small bar he owned. His men were inside, laughing, talking, but Victor remained behind the wheel. He replayed the moment again. The grab, the elbow, the sweep, 3 movements, no wasted effort, no anger. Victor had expected humiliation when he poured that tea. Instead, he had been given something else: perspective. He crushed the cigarette in the ashtray, then stepped out of the car. Years later, when Bruce Lee's name had become famous across the world, one of the waiters from that restaurant told the story to a newspaper reporter. The reporter asked him what he remembered most about that day. The waiter thought for a moment before answering. It wasn't the fight. Then what was it? The quiet. The reporter frowned. "What do you mean?" The waiter smiled slightly. "That man poured hot tea on Bruce Lee in a room full of people. And Bruce Lee never raised his voice," the reporter scribbled in his notebook. "And then?" The waiter leaned back in his chair. "Then he showed everyone something most people never understand." The reporter looked up. "What was that?" The waiter answered slowly. "That real strength doesn't make a scene. It just ends one. Victor Delgado did not forget the moment. Not that day, not the week after, and not the months that followed. At first, he tried to dismiss it. Men like Victor survived by convincing themselves they were always in control. Power on the street depended on reputation, and reputation depended on never appearing weak. But something about what had happened in that restaurant refused to sit quietly in his mind. He had been humiliated before in small ways. Arguments, fights that ended badly, deals that fell apart. Those things passed. This was different. Bruce Lee had not embarrassed him. He had not insulted him. He had not even raised his voice. Victor replayed the moment again and again. The tee, the shove, the sweep, the floor, 3 seconds. Victor had spent years believing strength meant size, numbers, intimidation. The man in that restaurant had quietly demonstrated something else entirely. Control. A week passed, then another. Life continued. Victor handled collections, dealt with arguments between men who owed money, managed the daily routine of running small businesses that operated in the gray spaces between legal and illegal. But every now and then, the memory surfaced again. The moment where everything he understood about power had collapsed in a crowded restaurant. One afternoon, Victor was driving through Chinatown when he noticed something. A small sign on a building window. Jun Fan Kung Fu Institute. He slowed the car. Through the window, he could see people training. Men moving across a wooden floor. Striking pads, practicing footwork. Victor parked across the street. He sat in the car watching. At the center of the room stood Bruce Lee. Even through the window, his movement was unmistakable, fast, precise, every motion controlled. Victor sat there for nearly 10 minutes before stepping out of the car. He crossed the street slowly. The door to the school was open. Inside, Bruce was demonstrating a drill to 2 students. He noticed Victor immediately, but he did not react. Victor stepped inside. The room grew quiet. Students stopped moving. They recognized Victor. Men like him were known in neighborhoods like this. Bruce finished the demonstration calmly. Then he turned. "Can I help you?" Victor stood near the door. For the first time since the restaurant incident, the 2 men looked at each other again. Victor nodded once. "You remember me," Bruce answered simply. "Yes." Victor looked around the room. "Nice place." "Thank you." One of the students stepped closer to Bruce quietly, unsure if trouble was coming. Victor noticed. He raised his hand slightly. "Relax." He looked back at Bruce. "I didn't come here for a fight." Bruce nodded. "I assumed that." Victor took a few slow steps into the room. He looked down at the training floor. "You run this place?" "Yes." Victor looked at the students. "They learning what you did to me?" A faint smile crossed Bruce's face. "They're learning how not to need to do it." Victor thought about that. Then he asked something that surprised even himself. "Can anyone learn it?" Bruce studied him carefully. "Anyone who is willing to train." Victor crossed his arms. "And if they're not used to discipline?" Bruce answered without hesitation. "Then discipline is what they learn first." The room remained quiet. Victor glanced toward the door, then back at Bruce. "You embarrassed me in that restaurant." Bruce shook his head. "You embarrassed yourself?" Victor paused, then nodded slowly. "Yeah." He walked a few steps across the floor. The wooden boards creaked under his weight. "You could have broken my arm." "Yes." "You didn't?" "No." Victor looked at him directly. "Why?" Bruce answered calmly. "Because breaking your arm would not have taught you anything useful." Victor laughed quietly. "Maybe it would have." Bruce shook his head. Pain fades quickly. Victor considered that. But understanding stays. The students watched the exchange carefully. Victor finally asked the question that had been building in his mind for weeks. How long does it take? Bruce raised an eyebrow. To do what? Victor gestured toward the floor. To learn how to move like that. Bruce smiled faintly. A lifetime? Victor chuckled. Yeah, I figured. He looked around the room again. Then he nodded once. All right. He turned toward the door. Halfway there, he stopped. Hey! Bruce looked up. Victor scratched the back of his neck. You mind if I watch sometime? Bruce shrugged lightly. The door is open. Victor nodded. Then he left. The students immediately began talking. Who was that? Bruce wiped sweat from his hands with a towel. Someone learning something. Jesse Glover shook his head. That guy looked like trouble. Bruce smiled. Trouble usually is. Weeks passed. Victor returned a few times, not often. He never trained. He never asked questions. He simply sat quietly against the wall and watched. He watched Bruce teach, watched the students move, watched the discipline, the focus, the structure. One afternoon, as Bruce locked up the school, he noticed Victor still sitting inside. Something on your mind? Victor shrugged. I've spent most of my life believing the strongest man in the room is the one everyone fears. Bruce leaned against the doorway. And now? Victor glanced at the training floor. Now I'm not so sure. Bruce nodded. That's a good place to start. Victor stood up. He looked around the empty room one last time. You ever think about what would have happened if you hit me that day? Bruce answered quietly. Yes. Victor waited. Bruce continued. You would have hit the floor the same way. Victor laughed. That's not what I meant. Bruce smiled slightly. I know. Victor walked toward the door. Before leaving, he said one final thing. That restaurant story. Bruce looked at him. Victor shrugged. I deserve that. Bruce shook his head again. No. Victor frowned. No? Bruce answered calmly. You needed it. Years later, long after Bruce Lee had become a global icon, people told stories about encounters like that one. Some stories were exaggerated, some were completely invented. But the people who had actually been in that restaurant remembered something very specific. They remembered the silence. They remembered the tea spilling across Bruce Lee's shirt. They remembered the large man who believed he controlled the room. And they remembered how quickly that belief collapsed. But what stayed with them the most was not the sweep, not the fall, not even the shock that followed. It was the way Bruce Lee had walked out afterward, calm, unbothered, as if the entire encounter had simply been another small moment in a much larger life. Because for Bruce Lee, that was exactly what it was. A reminder that real strength was never about dominating people. It was about mastering yourself. After that afternoon, life moved forward in ways no one inside that restaurant could have predicted. Bruce Lee returned to his daily rhythm with the same quiet focus he carried everywhere. Mornings began with conditioning, afternoons with students crossing the wooden floor of his school, and evenings filled with reflection on technique, timing, and human potential. For Bruce, combat was never the final goal. It was simply a doorway into deeper understanding. Across the city, Victor Delgado carried a different kind of lesson. The memory of that brief encounter stayed with him like an unanswered question. For years, he had believed authority came from intimidation and reputation. Yet one calm stranger had dismantled that belief without shouting, threatening, or humiliating him. Sometimes Victor would pass the training hall and pause across the street. Through the window he could see silhouettes practicing movement again and again. There was patience in those motions, a kind of quiet discipline he had never encountered in his world. Slowly, the meaning of that moment became clearer. Real mastery wasn't sudden or loud. It was built day after day, through effort, restraint, and clarity of purpose. And somewhere inside that small training hall, Bruce Lee continued walking that path, step by deliberate step,